Welcome to Veil of Shadows, Book 1, The Amulet of Shadows, by Marie Mayer.
Chapter 1, Rot at the Forest Edge. The morning should have smelled of thawing earth. Elara knew the scent the way she knew the shape of her own hands. Dirt waking under a thin crust of winter, the clean bite of pine resin warming in first light, the faint sweetness of sap starting to run. It was the smell that promised the world had decided, once again, to continue. Today, the air tasted wrong. She paused at the old deer path where the manor's back fields surrendered to the woods. The grass there was usually stubborn, even in late winter, pale and wiry but alive, quick to spring back under a boot. Now it lay flattened in a dull slick, as if something had breathed on it and taken its will away. Elara crouched and brushed her fingertips over a clump near the path's edge. It crumbled. Not like dried grass, not like a dead leaf. It fell apart the way ash does, soft, soundless, leaving a faint smear on her skin. She stared at the gray dust clinging to her fingertips and felt, absurdly, as if she'd touched the remains of something that had burned without flame. Behind her, the manor stood quiet. Its windows caught the thin sunlight and gave it back without warmth. The place always felt a little too large for her, as if it had been built to hold more voices than it currently did. The hedges along the back wall were trimmed and proper, an inheritance of care she maintained out of habit more than pride. Beyond them the woods began, and those belonged to no one. She had come out here because she hadn't slept. Or rather, she had slept in pieces, drifting and waking to the same uneasy impression, like the house itself was holding its breath. On her third waking, she had given up and pulled on her boots. She had told herself she was going out to clear her head, but she had walked straight to the tree line as if summoned. A crow called overhead, hoarse and impatient. Then it went quiet too. The hush that followed was not the calm of early morning. It was the kind of silence that came after an argument, when everyone has said too much and is waiting to see what will happen next. Elara rose and stepped off the path. The first tree she approached was an alder, old, with bark that should have been dark and damp at the base, moss thick in the crevices. The moss was there, but it looked bleached. The bark beneath was covered with tiny holes, like pin pricks, as if a swarm of insects had tried to burrow in and then died before it could finish. She leaned closer. There was a smell beneath the wrongness now, faint but unmistakable. Iron and something sweetly rancid, like fruit left too long in a bowl. Her stomach tightened. "Okay," she murmured to no one, as if naming the unease could make it smaller. "What are you?" She looked for obvious causes first, because that was what you did when you were trying not to slide into the shapes your mind could make when it had no better explanation. Disease, a fungus, poison. But as she moved deeper into the trees, the pattern sharpened in a way that disease rarely did. The rot did not spread in a natural gradient. It had edges, clean lines where life remained stubborn and green, and then, abruptly, it ended in gray, like a stain. Elara followed it, step by careful step, until she found the center. A small clearing opened between the trees, more a widened pocket in the understory than a proper clearing, ringed with young fir and bramble. Snow lingered in the shade, dirty and granular. In the middle of the clearing stood a low stump, cut years ago, its top weathered smooth by rain and sun. Something had been carved into it. Elara stopped at the edge of the clearing, instinctively bracing as though the air might strike her. The symbol was dark against the pale wood, not ink, not paint. It looked burned, but the stump showed no char. The lines were too crisp for scorch, a circle broken at the top. Inside it, a shape like a crown. 3 points, the center taller than the others. Beneath it, a long downward stroke, as if the crown had been pinned to the earth. The longer she stared, the more the lines seemed to shift. Not literally moving, but refusing to settle into something harmless. The symbol made her eyes want to blink, to look away. She didn't. A pulse moved through the clearing. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a tremor. It was the sensation you get when thunder rolls far away and your ribs feel it before your ears do. Elara's skin tightened. The fine hairs along her arms lifted. Something beneath the soil, beneath the stump, beneath the snow, answered the symbol as if it were a key. Her throat went dry. She took one step forward. The bramble along the clearing's edge quivered. At first she thought it was wind. Then she realized the air was still. A shimmer moved through the tangled branches like light refracting off water. The thorns clicked against each other, a small, sharp sound. Elara held very still, her breath slow, eyes scanning the bramble. Something small and bright flitted between the branches. A flicker of blue, no bigger than her hand, darted up, hovered, and then dipped back down, quick as a dragonfly. A sprite. Elara had seen sprites before. Everyone in town had, though they rarely admitted it openly. They were the sort of thing people dismissed as imagination until a bowl of cream left on a windowsill was mysteriously emptied, or until a child came home swearing a tiny person had stolen their ribbon and laughed about it. Sprites were mischief made in flesh. They pinched, they hid things, they tangled hair. They were the wood's way of reminding humans they were not the only ones who could claim a path or a patch of land. They were not supposed to be here, this close to the manor, this early, this tense. The blue flicker rose again, closer this time. It hovered at Elara's shoulder height, wings beating so fast they blurred into a translucent halo. Its body was slender, almost delicate, but its face, small and sharp, was twisted into something that was not playful. Its eyes were too dark. Sprite's eyes were usually bright, like polished berries, full of a quick intelligence. This one's gaze looked like a hole punched into the air. It bared its teeth. Elara didn't move. She felt the old reflex to soothe, to speak gently, to be careful with creatures that lived half in story and half in bone. She had learned early that the woods listened to tone as much as words. "Hello?" she said softly. The sprite made a thin, shrill sound in response. Behind it, another flicker appeared. Green this time, and then another and another, until the bramble seemed full of glints. They gathered like sparks. Elara's heart began to beat faster, not with fear exactly, but with the kind of awareness that came when you stepped too close to a nest and realized you had been watched the entire time. She lifted her empty hands, palms forward. "I'm not here to take anything," she said. A sudden sting struck the back of her hand. She flinched, more from surprise than pain. A tiny dart, maybe a thorn, maybe something else, stuck in her skin. She yanked it out reflexively. A bead of blood welled up. The sprite's wings buzzed louder, and the clearing's pulse deepened, like something pleased. Elara stared at the blood, and a cold realization moved through her. The symbol, the pulse, the sudden hostility. They weren't reacting to her presence. They were reacting to her blood. The blue sprite darted forward again, and this time it didn't just hover. It lunged. Elara jerked back, but not fast enough. The sprite raked its tiny claws across her knuckles. The cut was shallow, but the sting was immediate and hot. "Stop," she said, sharper now. The word carried more force than she intended. It wasn't a command, not in the way a person might order a dog, but something older. An impulse that rose from somewhere beneath thought. The air thickened. For a heartbeat, the sprites froze. Their wings continued to beat, but their bodies held suspended, as if caught in invisible resin. The bramble's quiver stilled. Elara felt it in her bones. Something in her had reached out. Her breath caught. She had not meant to do that. The sensation lasted only a moment. Then it snapped, and the sprites surged forward with renewed fury, as if insulted by her resistance. Elara's body moved before her mind caught up. She stepped back out of the clearing and into the trees, turning sideways to slip between a fir and a low branch. The sprites followed, their buzzing rising like angry insects. She ducked, swatted at the air, felt a sharp pinch at her ear and another sting at her wrist. "Enough," she hissed. A flicker of shadow moved across the ground. She didn't cast it. The sun hadn't shifted. It came from her. The shade beneath the trees seemed to deepen, pooling around her boots as if the earth had spilled ink. The sprites hesitated midair, their wings faltering. Elara froze, startled by the sudden darkness. The shadow curled upward, thin as smoke, and she felt it tug. Not at her skin, but at something inside her, a quiet thread she hadn't known existed. It wanted to rise. It wanted to wrap around the buzzing lights and pull. Her stomach turned. No. She clenched her hands into fists, nails biting into her palms. She forced the sensation down, the way you force a gasp back when you're trying not to cry. The shadow receded, reluctant. The sprites hovered, vibrating with uncertainty. Then, as if some invisible signal had been given, they turned as one and fled back toward the clearing, vanishing into the bramble with a final angry hiss of wings. Silence rushed in to fill the space they left behind. Elara stood between the trees, breathing hard, her pulse loud in her ears. Her hand throbbed where the sprite had cut her. A thin line of blood had dried along her knuckle. She looked down at her boots. The ground beneath them was normal. Brown earth, scattered needles, a few stubborn green shoots. The shadow that had pooled there was gone, leaving only the ordinary shade of the forest. She swallowed. Her mind tried to shove what had just happened into a safer category. Adrenaline, imagination, a trick of light. But the sting on her ear and the blood on her hand refused to become a story she could dismiss. Elara turned back toward the clearing. She didn't step in again. She stayed at the tree's edge, staring at the stump and the symbol carved into its top. The pulse still moved through the air, steady as a heartbeat. The symbol looked like a crown, she thought again, and felt foolish immediately. Crowns belonged to fairy tales and old paintings. Crowns didn't belong burned into a stump at the edge of her property. And yet, her mother's face rose in her mind with no invitation, not as a clear memory, but as a feeling. Warmth in a room, the smell of lavender and paper, the hush of a voice reading aloud. Her mother had been gone for years. The town spoke of her in past tense with the careful politeness people used when they didn't want to stir grief. Elara had learned to speak the same way. But sometimes, late at night, She would find herself standing outside her mother's locked study door, hand resting against the wood, as if she could feel something on the other side. A pulse. Like this. Elara's throat tightened. She forced herself to look away from the symbol and down at the earth around the stump. The snow there was discolored, grayish. The grass was dead. Even the bramble nearest the stump looked brittle, its thorns dull, rot, with edges, as if something had been fed. Her gaze snagged on the base of the stump. In the damp ring where it met the soil, there was another mark, smaller, half hidden in mud. Not carved, but pressed into the ground as if something had been set there and lifted away. A circle, broken at the top. Elara felt her skin prickle. She stepped closer, careful this time, staying outside the clearing but leaning in enough to see. The pressed mark was fresh. The soil around it was disturbed, small grooves as if something had been dragged. Someone had been here, not sprites, not animals. Someone who understood symbols and knew where to place them. Elara straightened, suddenly aware of the woods around her in a different way. Every tree felt like a witness. Every shadow felt like it might be watching. She turned slowly, scanning between trunks. Nothing moved, but the silence had changed. It was no longer merely tense, it was attentive. Elara's heartbeat slowed, not because she calmed, but because some instinct told her to listen. The pulse in the clearing continued, steady and patient. She backed away, one step at a time, not taking her eyes off the trees until the manor's back hedges came into view again. Only then did she turn fully and walk quickly toward the house, boots crunching over brittle grass. At the hedge line, she stopped and looked down at her hand. Blood had dried there, dark against her skin. She wiped it on her sleeve and immediately regretted it, as if the act might leave some trace behind. A scent, a signal. Her stomach tightened again. Inside the manor, everything would be quiet and still. That was how the house always was. It would smell of old wood and cooled tea. It would not explain why the woods had turned hostile, or why a crown-shaped symbol had been burned into a stump. But it would have walls. It would have doors she could close. She started forward again, and then froze. Beyond the hedges, at the very edge of the woods, a flicker of blue hovered for a heartbeat between two branches, not hostile now, watching. Elara's breath caught. The sprite did not move closer. It did not bare its teeth. It only hovered, its dark eyes fixed on her, and then, with a small, deliberate dip, as if in mock politeness, it vanished. Elara stood very still until her lungs demanded air. Then she exhaled and walked to the manor without looking back. By afternoon, the blight had spread. She saw it from the kitchen window while the kettle boiled, gray patches blooming across the back field like bruises. The grass nearest the woods had lost its color. A line of shrubs along the fence sagged as if their roots had been cut. Elara set her hand against the cool glass. Somewhere out there, beneath the stump, beneath the soil, something pulsed steadily, patient as a heart. And it was waking. She lifted her injured hand, flexed her fingers, and watched the thin cuts pull taut. The sting had faded to an itch, but the memory of that shadow pooling at her feet remained, too vivid, too wrong to ignore. The kettle began to scream. Elara didn't move to silence it right away. She kept staring at the field, at the spreading gray, as if she could will it to stop simply by watching. It didn't. When she finally turned from the window, it was with the quiet certainty of someone who has felt a door open somewhere they cannot yet see. Something had begun. and it had chosen her edge of the world to start. Thank you for listening to Veil of Shadows. If you'd like to continue the journey, the next chapter is available in the playlist. Until then, may the balance hold.